Good day, class. In this lesson, we will learn to solve quadratic equations using the square root property. Keep in mind that as we solve quadratic equations, all of these methods are available to us. In particular, factoring, the square root property, completing the square, the quadratic formula, and graphing. You will need to understand the difference in all of these different types of methods and when to employ them. We'll practice that after we learn to use each of the methods. In this lesson, we will learn to use the square root property method. It is important as we use the square root property to always be able to successfully recognize perfect squares. So we have perfect squares up to the number 20 right here on your screen. Let's start with the number 0. We know that 0 times itself is 0. We know that 1 times itself is 1. We know that 2 times itself, or 2 times 2, makes 4. We know that 3 times itself, or 3 times 3, makes 9, and so forth. Therefore, we also know the square root values of these numbers. Let's take a look at 4 and 16, for example. Since 4 times itself makes 16, then the square root of 16 indicates the number that has been multiplied by itself to give us 16. And we know that that number is 4. Therefore, the square root of 16 is 4. Now, secondarily, we'll take a look at what it means when we take the square root of a variable. So here we're looking at x squared, x raised to the second power. Well, that in its fundamental form means x times x. X has been multiplied by itself. That's what it means to square a value. Well, if I take the square root of a value that's already squared, I'm asking for the number that was multiplied by itself. Well, in this case, the number that was multiplied by itself is x. Therefore, the square root of x squared is x. So the beauty of this entire method, the square root property method of solving quadratic equations, is that we can always get back to that basic variable of x or y or whatever variable in which we're dealing, if we can just take the square root of it because it's already a perfect square when that value has been squared. So now we'll move on to some specific examples. Here we have x squared is equal to 4, and your challenge is to identify the number that has been squared to make 4. So you'll take the square root of both sides. So that's all that you have to do is take the square root of both sides and then simplify, because the square root of x squared is x and the square root of 4 is, now note, I have plus or minus 2 there. And the reason that I have that is because 2 could have been squared to give me 4, and negative 2 could have been squared to yield 4. So we have to keep in mind and even indicate that either of those two values could have been the solution. Remember, quadratic equations have more than one solution. So we're going to go with plus or minus 2 as our solution to this equation. That means positive 2 is a solution and negative 2 is a solution. In this example, it's very similar to our last example, but we have to see it kind of in a provincial light. It's very much like the last example, except that negative 7 is sitting there and it's being subtracted. That 7 is being subtracted from x squared. So if we could just move that and get that over there with the other constant, then we're kind of thinking outside of the box a little bit. We're using our critical thinking skills. And now we have our constants together. We combine those. And this looks very much like the last problem example that we were working on.